My name's Jeff McCurry. I'm the director of the Simon Silverman Phenomenology Center, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our 32nd Annual Symposium, Phenomenology in the African and Africana Worlds. I'm glad you're here. I know some of you are here from on campus. Some of you are here from Pittsburgh and the greater Pittsburgh area, and I think some people have traveled a few hours, which is a notable feat in light of the recent weather. As many of you know, the Phenomenology Center's main purpose is to creatively advance research in phenomenology. And one of the ways to do so is to try to broaden phenomenology's reach, or better put, perhaps, to show the reach phenomenology has always implicitly had, but which many may not have realized that it had. Phenomenology, at least explicitly, began in Europe. And could we say that much phenomenological research has focused on European and North Atlantic thinkers and, dare we say, European and North Atlantic experience? As we've learned from many different thinkers, the temptation to make the local or contingent into the global or universal is strong, and we can wonder whether enough phenomenology has fully avoided this temptation. This year's symposium aims to help phenomenology become what it should always have been and what it should always be, an exploration into the essences of human experience wherever and however human experience is found, by inquiring into African and Africana practices and experiences. It is also fitting that such a symposium is happening here at Duquesne, where there's a tradition of the study of African traditions and experience, and where this is a university that has long benefited from the presence of Africans, especially the many African Spiritan priests who have studied and taught here at this Spiritan University. We are extremely pleased to have 4 speakers at the cutting edge of African and Africana thought. I'm grateful for our speakers' participation over the next 2 days and for the audience's participation. Of course, Dick Roysevich is here, who was the first director of the center, and he and the other founders decided that they didn't want the symposium simply to be a lecture series. They wanted it to be a symposium. And some of you, probably many of you, have read Plato's Symposium. A symposium is a conversation. And so Dick and the other founders of the center really wanted this to be not simply an event where there was a lecture that was passively received, but a living dialogue. And so you all are part of that tradition. Please let me know if there's anything I can do for you. Let me introduce my 2 colleagues. Ms. Chelsea Benny is the graduate assistant of the Phenomenology Center, and Ms. Angelle Pryor in the back is the Phenomenology Center librarian. If any of you need anything, please speak with us. We'd like to make your time here as pleasurable as possible. Let me also just say the weather situation has been a bit of a challenge. We have 4 speakers. You might notice there are only 2 here. The other 2 are hoping to get here today. One of them was coming, Professor Mudimbe was coming from Durham, North Carolina, which some of you may know was completely shut down over the last few days, including the airport. And so one change that we're making is that Professor Bongbo will be giving his lecture this afternoon instead of tomorrow, and Professor Mudimbe will be giving his lecture tomorrow instead of today. So things have been a little bit in flux, but I don't think it will affect the quality of the conversation. It's now my pleasure to welcome someone who has been a strong supporter of the Phenomenology Center and also the focus on Africa at Duquesne, Dr. Charles Doherty, President of Duquesne University, to officially open the symposium.
Good morning. Welcome to Duquesne University, and in particular, welcome to our Africa room. Those of you who are regular attendees or who have some background in phenomenology know why we do this on a regular basis, and Jeff's given you a nice summary of that. Basically, to give you the shortest rendering of it, Europeans, Spiritans came here in the late 50s and 60s. They brought phenomenology with them. and it began to grow in our philosophy, psychology, theology departments, and even in nursing. And we became a center for phenomenological thought and research across the nation. When I was doing my own dissertation in the mid-'70s, I was counseled that there were only 2 or 3 places in the United States to consider, and one of them was Duquesne University. So I knew that firsthand. So let me talk instead about what you might not know so much about, and that is our African heritage here, and tell you that the Spiritans have long been missionaries to Africa. In the 1840s, under the guidance of the co-founder, Francis Lieberman, they entered West Africa in large numbers, and though many of them died immediately from encountering diseases that were unknown to Europeans, they eventually did very well in West Africa. And then in 1868 entered East Africa, although the coastline was controlled by Arab slave traders. They were able to enter, in a sense, to hopscotch over that and to come inland in their missionary work. In the period of time since then, more than 1,000 Spiritans have died in Africa, but they have left behind millions and millions of Catholics because of their work. That's the missionary side of it. In 1956, right here, a Center for African Affairs was established. It was the first comprehensive program on Africa in the United States. In 1960, we attracted a man named Alphonse Lugman, a Spiritan, who was a leading expert on Swahili. And by the mid-60s, Duquesne was the only university in the Western Hemisphere that taught all 4 major languages of Africa at the same time in the curriculum: Arabic, Hausa, Lingala, and Swahili. Around that time, 9 of the 100 National Defense Foreign Language Fellowships given by the United States government, 9 of them were held by Duquesne students. Now a little bit about our future. Starting back first, if you go back to 1980, which is, given this long history I've just been talking about, not so long ago, 95% of the members of the congregation, the Spiritans, were from Europe and North America, and only 4% were from Africa. So a very strong presence and leadership from Europeans and Americans. Now, today's configuration of seminarians, these are people who have already taken their first vows and are on their way to the priesthood, and who will be the members of the congregation shortly, and therefore the leaders of the congregation of tomorrow, and not so far into tomorrow. 2.3% of the seminarians are from North, South America, Asia, and the Caribbean. Another 2.4% are from Europe. 92.8% of all the Spiritans are from Africa. So we are well on our way to becoming an African congregation. And that is why, for us, the importance of reaching out to Africa. We have started an African studies program, and we're creating links to African universities and trying to attract as many African priests and scholars here as we can. And in conclusion, why I was delighted to see the two great traditions of the university, phenomenology and Africa, come together in this very meeting. So my congratulations to you, and I wish you Godspeed in examining the confluence of what Duquesne has been all about. Thank you.
Thank you, President Doherty. It's now my pleasure to welcome Father Brian Cronin, who is Professor of Philosophy here at Duquesne, and is going to be our moderator for the first session. Father Brian, as you'll hear from his lilt, is from Ireland, but he has spent 30 years as a missionary priest and seminary teacher in Tanzania. And so it's my pleasure to welcome Father Brian.
My function as a moderator is to introduce the speakers and to keep the peace during the discussion afterwards. I was very happy to meet with Senai Serekweberham. I hope that's as near as I can possibly get to it. We were in Boston College together, and we did our doctorates in the 1980s. He's from Eritrea originally. He is a professor of the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Morgan State University of Baltimore. He has also taught at Boston College, the University of Massachusetts at Boston, Hampshire College, Simmons College, and Brown University, and has served as a research associate for the William Monroe Trotter Institute. After receiving his PhD in philosophy from Boston College in 1988, he has pursued research crossing between the Continental philosophical tradition and the African and Africana philosophical traditions. He's editor of African Philosophy, The Essential Readings, and he is author of The Hermeneutics of African Philosophy, Horizon and Discourse, Our Heritage, the Past and Present of African American and African Existence, and Contested Memory, the Icons of the Continental Tradition, in addition to several other scholarly works. So we welcome him to start our discussion and to make the first presentation. And he will be speaking on the connection between his continental philosophy and African philosophy. So we welcome him.
Okay, good morning, and thank you very much for inviting me. What I have for you today is a paper, basically something that I've extracted from a book I'm working on a book entitled Existence and Heritage, which should be a kind of hermeneutical exploration of our post-colonial situation, in the sense that colonialism has ended, and yet the presuppositions, conceptions, ideas, prejudices that structured the functioning of colonialism are still with us. So the question that the book is concerned with is, how then do we surpass this, right? And there's a chapter in the book, the second chapter, where I talk about the continental tradition and the African philosophical tradition. And so this paper is something that I've extracted from that. The paper is titled Continental and African Philosophy, a Thematic Encounter. And I begin with a proverb, an African proverb from Igbo land, which says, "Another man's corpse seems to us like a log of wood." Hopefully, at the end of the paper, I'll also comment on this proverb, but hopefully what the proverb asserts and what the paper argues hopefully will connect. So I'll read the paper, and I know I have a little accent, which I don't want to lose. But I know it presents problems, so I'm going to read it slowly. Continental and African Philosophy, a Thematic Encounter. Another man's corpse seems to us like a log of wood. Continental and African philosophy are two areas of contemporary discourse whose thematic explorations, starting from differing angles in our common human situation, entwine and in part validate their respective theoretic engagements. In an article titled African Philosophy's Challenge to Continental Philosophy, Robert Bernasconi points to the fruitful possibilities of this entwining and concludes by noting that, quote, if continental philosophers would open themselves to a critique from African philosophy and thereby learn more about their own tradition seen from the outside, they would find that the hegemonic concept of reason had been displaced, and they would be better placed to learn to respect other traditions, including those that are not African, end quote. Analogously, Fred Dahlmeyer's attentive exploration of themes in contemporary African philosophy and his accurate observation that, quote, despite differences of accent and orientation, the teachings of Heidegger and Cabral do not basically conflict regarding the return to the source or the origin, end quote. This shows that there is here a common thematic that, while deriving from differing orientations, plows a shared terrain. What I hope to do in this paper is to explore this common ground of questioning and reflection. Broadly speaking, contemporary African philosophy is a discourse that originates in African intellectual efforts to reclaim the humanity of Africa. Initially, it was provoked by Father Placid Temple's book, Bantu Philosophy, of 1945, and has developed since as both a positive and critical response to this provocation. It is also focused on thinking the character of the independence that Africa has attained. In this regard, it is related to Kwame Nkrumah's efforts in conscientism to find ways of mediating the intersecting heritages of Africa, Western, Islamic, and indigenous. Within the scope of this thematic, it utilizes the works of Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, and the reflective heritage of the African liberation movement as a whole, to conceptualize ways of ameliorating the dismal contemporary post-colonial African situation. Again, broadly put, continental philosophy is a tradition of thought rooted in the ancient Greeks and which in more recent times takes its basic orientation from the dialectical thinking of Hegel and from the concerns and issues opened up by Heidegger's being question and the existential hermeneutic orientation that it grounds. In this respect, Hans-Georg Gadamer's philosophical hermeneutics is a validation of Heidegger's conception of the force structure of human understanding and an appropriation of the self-unfolding and self-correcting Hegelian dialectic thought of from within the bounds of human finitude. Gianni Vattimo's pensiero debole, or weak thought, on the other hand, is aimed at spelling out the effects that follow from the thinking of Nietzsche and Heidegger in their stance towards the metaphysical tradition, focused on utilizing these effects to think the lived situation of our contemporary world. There is here an overlap or an entwining of areas of concern, for the dismal contemporary post-colonial African situation is internal to and punctuates in various direct and indirect ways the lived situation of our contemporary world. With this understanding in mind, in what follows, I explore this overlap. I start with the critique of a retrograde stance on the non-European world expressed from within the bounds of continental philosophy. I then go on to explore more helpful and agreeable views on the non-Western world expressed by three central figures in the continental tradition. In conclusion, I highlight the terrain of the thematic encounter mentioned in the title. In 1957, the same year the Gold Coast secured its independence and appropriated the ancient name Ghana as the designation for its newly won freedom, Emmanuel Levinas penned an article, Lévi-Bruchul in Contemporary Philosophy, approvingly exploring the notion of primitive mentality. This was later republished in 1991 as part of a collection of texts under the title Entre nous, Essai sur la pense à l'autre, or Entre nous, Thinking of the Other. Thus, in the very year Africa was beginning to rid itself of the political shackles that held it in subjection, it was tacitly on the level of reflection and ideas being penned into subordinate status. And 34 years later, the same constricting gesture was reaffirmed. And yet Levinas is a philosopher whose philosophic reflections, focused on the theme of the other, are grounded on the expressivity of the human face and on the face-to-face encounter of the other. For as Levinas puts it, quote, free beings alone can be strangers to one another. Their freedom, which is common to them, is also precisely what separates them. This common freedom, which also separates, is for Levinas what calls for thinking, or ought to call for thinking. His endorsement of Lévi-Bruhl, however, must mean that this concern of thinking is limited to only Europe and the West. For as is well known, Lévi-Bruhl's views on the mentality of primitives, which towards the end of his life he repudiated, had nothing to do with their freedom. The other, the primitive, in Lévi-Bruhl's rather myopic view, is effectively effaced in her or his freedom and encased in a distinctiveness which excludes him or her from the common universe of human experience. The primitive, for Lévi-Bruhl, unlike Western man, is confined within, quote, the general laws governing collective representation, end quote, and thus is encased in a mentality, a chaotic, mystical, allogical kind of mind, without, properly speaking, rhyme or reason. Levinas does not see that the horrors of World War II, which affected him on a personal level, originate in the brutality of such exclusion, first visited on the colonized and sanctioned by Lévi-Bruhl's rather bizarre theoretic formulations. By the way, I think I skipped it, but Lévi-Bruhl, in essence, repudiates this view towards the end of his life, as is, as documented in his posthumous writings. Okay. Levinas does not see that the horrors of World War II, which affected him on a personal level, originate in the brutality of such exclusion, first visited on the colonized and sanctioned by Lévi-Bruhl's rather bizarre theoretic formulations. He does not see, as Aimé Césaire insightfully points out, that before being its victim, Europe was the willing accomplice of this exclusionary brutality. And so, for Levinas, quote, despite the end of Europocentrism, disqualified by so many horrors, I believe in the eminence of the human face expressed in Greek letters, and in our own, which owe the Greeks everything. It is thanks to them that our history makes us ashamed. There is a participation in Holy Scripture, in the national literatures of Europe, in the Book of Books, which all the letters of the world awaited or upon which they comment. The Holy Scriptures do not signify, he says, through the dogmatic tale of their supernatural or sacred origin, but through the expression of the face of the other man that they illuminate before he gives himself a countenance or a pose, end quote. It does not occur to Levinas in the above, expressed in a radio interview in 1982, the same year of the Sabra and Shatila massacres in Lebanon of Palestinian refugees by the Lebanese Christian Phalangist militia, actively aided by the Israeli Defense Force. Does not occur to Levinas that the lived experience of the non-European world in its encounter of the European face and with Holy Scriptures has been a darkening experience of desecration. It does not occur to him that the interhuman, as he puts it, in this encounter is not a transcending in the other towards God, but a brazen defacement of this very relation. As Levinas puts it, quote, since the other looks at me, I am responsible for him, end quote. What then of the look, the face of the massacre of Sabra and Shatila? What is illuminated beyond the banality of neighbor attacking neighbor and the question of knowing who is right and who is wrong? Isn't our diminished humanity emblazoned writ large in the contorted death agonies on the countenance, the face of the dying? Levinas does not see, as James Baldwin does, for example, reflecting on the deplorable situation of the African American community of his day, that, quote, it is a terrible and inexorable law that one cannot deny the humanity of another without diminishing one's own. In the face of one's victim, one sees oneself. Walk through the streets of Harlem and see what we, this nation, have become, end quote. Levinas does not see that if, as he tells us, the third world is ravaged by hunger, this is so because since the 15th century and to this very day, it is and has been ravaged by Europe's mission civilisatrice and the debilitating discourse on development that, in refusing to see the other, sanctions and perpetuates this same devastation. Levinas does not see that equating Christianity with civilization and paganism with savagery, as Césaire points out in Discourse on Colonialism, has always had abominable consequences, that it has always resulted not in contact and mutual edification, but in the reciprocal brutalization and enfeeblement of our shared humanity. And so, unmindful of all of the above, Levinas lightheartedly explains, and this is in various interviews, and I quote, "I often say," he says, "though it's a dangerous thing to say publicly," he says this as he's saying it publicly, "that humanity consists of the Bible and the Greeks. All the rest can be translated. All the rest, all the exotic is dance." Again, in another interview, he tells us, quote, "Europe, that's the Bible and the Greeks," and adds, quote, "everything else in the world must be included in this. I do not have any nostalgia for the exotic. For me, Europe is central," end quote. Here it has to be noted, Levinas is simply endorsing the age-old hubris of the Occident that sees itself as the sum and substance of all that has value in humanity, a view which is the sine qua non of colonialist thinking. Writing in 1945, at the height of the colonial era, for example, Temples, a missionary priest, expressed the classic formulation of this view when he stated that, quote, "our civilizing mission alone can justify our occupation of the lands of uncivilized peoples," end quote. And this justification is a process of systematically reducing everything to the same. That is, to the Bible and the Greeks in Levinas's formulation. According to Levinas and Temples, then, that which is labeled uncivilized or exotic as the very embodiment of what is alien to humanity is to be included, superseded, and preserved, or, in the language of the day, assimilated. This is how, for example, Baldwin, writing in 1959, describes this sinister procedure of inclusion. Baldwin writes, quote, "Assimilation was but another name for the very special brand of relations between human beings which had been imposed by colonialism. These relations demanded that the individual, torn from the context to which he owed his identity, should replace his habits of feeling, thinking, and acting by another set of habits which belonged to the strangers who dominated him," end quote. Negate the native and conserve or save the human in the native. In other words, save the human essence encased in the husk of an inferior culture. This is the double action Temple describes as our civilizing mission, a view in keeping with Levinas's assertion that everything else in the world must be included within Europe. Odd as it may seem, this is the candid view of Levinas, who has personally experienced the horrors of such racial labeling. As he tells us in 1990, 5 years before the end of his extremely prolific life, quote, "Racism is not just opposed to such and such a particular point in Christian and liberal culture. It is not a particular dogma concerning democracy, parliamentary government, dictatorial regimes, or religious politics that is in question. It is the very humanity of man," end quote. In other words, racism puts in question the very humanity of man. But then, when Levinas labels all that which is other than the Bible and the Greeks as the exotic, and as having to be included within Europe, is he not putting in question the very humanity of all that which lies beyond Europe? Is he not repeating a gesture and, in substance, validating a stance which calls to mind the horrors of World War II? These horrors, and the political shake-up of the colonized, partly triggered by them, created the context in which the odd idea of the European mission to civilize the world was put in question. The colonized, the uncivilized, and or the exotic, in rejecting their subjection, challenged the fabrications that had befuddled them thus far. and concretely recommenced the political struggles that had defined their existence prior to their brutal pacification. As Basil Davidson points out, after 1945, the colonial powers could still resist the process of decolonization, but they could not stop it, end quote. Thus, the idea of a single and true human history with Europe at the helm had gradually started to unravel. Bit by bit, Africa and the non-European world as a whole secured formal independence. As Jean-Paul Sartre noted in his preface to Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, quote, "Not so long ago, the Earth numbered 2,000 million inhabitants, 500 million human beings, and 1,500 million natives. The former had the world, the latter only its use." End quote. The attainment of formal independence effectively inserted Africa and the formerly colonized world into history. It instituted, beyond segregators and segregated, colonizers and colonized, a shared world of human existence. It negated, on a formal level, the distinction between human beings and natives, Western man and the primitive, or, in Levinas's formulation, the Bible and the Greeks and all the rest. On this side of the Atlantic, as Baldwin writing in 1961 tells us, it had an electrifying effect. The emergence of Africa, he tells us, led to the political existential situation in which, quote, "the American Negro can no longer, nor will he ever again be controlled by white America's image of him," end quote. In this regard, it ought to be noted, at least in passing, that the shattering of this image is in part a concrete antecedent to tangible developments that have made possible the election and re-election of an African-American president in the dawning years of the 21st century. Thus, and in spite of shortcomings and blatant paradoxes, the attainment of formal independence, to the extent that it fulfilled a felt minimal need, established a new etap, a new stage. It made the hypocrisy, the bad faith of the past untenable, enforcing the recognition on a formal level of the explicit equality of all peoples. It has created the context in which more complex and more substantive political ethical struggles could commence and be undertaken in earnest. Thus today, as a cumulative effect of all of the above, in the second decade of the 21st century, a great deal has changed, and a much more encouraging situation prevails. Reflecting on the scene that defines the climate of critical self-awareness, for example, the Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, writing in 2002, states, "The days are long gone," quote, "the days are long gone when Europeans and other Westerners could consider their experience and culture as the norm towards which the whole of humanity was headed, so that the other could be understood as an earlier stage on the same road that they had trodden, the same road that they had taken," end quote. In the same vein, in 2001, Hans-Georg Gadamer categorically affirms, quote, "We need to accept our worldwide heritage, not only in its otherness, but also in recognizing the validity of the claims this larger heritage makes on us," end quote. In like manner, the Italian philosopher Gianni Vattimo, writing in 1996, declares, "History, quote, history after the end of colonialism and the dissolution of Eurocentric prejudices does not have anymore a unitary sense. It has fractured into a number of stories, irreducible to a single guiding thread," end quote. It can thus be said that in and through these thinkers, and against the historical grain of the continental tradition, the actuality of a variegated humanity reasserts itself. A long-censored multiplicity reaffirms itself, using for this very purpose the spokesman of the reason that had suppressed it. For indeed, the above three thinkers articulate, out of their own thinking and in their own way, the refusal to submit that had been the defiance of those who first confronted colonialism. In effect, the above pronouncements indicate that, in principle, the days of Western arrogance and domination are passé. They indicate that the Eurocentric single guiding thread with which the Occident had firmly bound the world is de facto unraveling. And as a task of the present, these pronouncements call for the consolidation of this unraveling by the tangible articulation of de jure philosophic self-validations of this multiplicity. It is imperative to note that these pronouncements stand in stark contrast to Levinas's remarks, which express a kind of residual, lingering nostalgia for the good old days, not in keeping anymore with the zeitgeist of our present. Until fairly recently, however, such views as those expressed by Taylor, Gadamer, and Vattimo were not acceptable in mainstream continental philosophy. It ought to be remembered that it was, in Vattimo's words, by clinging to a single guiding thread that Immanuel Kant, for example, could assert that the Occident, quote, will probably give law eventually to all the others, end quote. And why should this be the case? Because, as Kant tells us, unlike animals, human beings need discipline in their tender years and moral formation as they mature. For this is what constitutes the humanity of human beings as such. And he adds for good measure regarding non-Europeans, quote, we see this also among savage nations, who, though they may discharge functions for some time like Europeans, yet can never become accustomed to European manners. With them, however, it is not the noble love of freedom, which Rousseau and others imagine, but a kind of barbarism, the animal, he says, the animal, so to speak, not having yet developed its human nature, end quote. Today, this blatant equating of humanity with European manners and non-European peoples with savage nations is no longer fashionable. It is not any more acceptable to view non-Europeans as the animal. Today, views of this kind, if ever expressed in public, manage only to tarnish those who uphold them. They boomerang and betray the insularity of the confidence from whence they are expressed. And yet Gadamer, the self-same Gadamer who I quoted just now, urging us in 2001 to be open to our worldwide heritage, in a text published in 1978, refers to Kant as, quote, the greatest thinker of the idea of freedom who ever lived, end quote. It is clear, at least to me, it is clear that we are here facing an inconsistency that is not and yet needs to be taken into account. For in our words and deeds, as Gadamer is well aware, consistency and rigor are indispensable components of philosophic reflection, which is a kind of reflection that incessantly assesses and calibrates itself in light of current concerns. Kant, furthermore, does not stand alone in holding and expressing the kind of views quoted above. By engaging in a destructive reading of the major figures of the modern European tradition, Locke, Hobbes, Hume, Kant, Hegel, Marx, and others, one can show how this Eurocentric single guiding thread has constituted and defined the Occident's own narcissistic universalizing of itself. This narcissism, so boldly expressed by Kant and echoed by Levinas, is an embarrassing residue, a residue of bygone days, when, intoxicated by scientific achievements, the West violently globalized its parochial vision of itself. Today, major thinkers in continental philosophy openly disavow this Eurocentric stance and endorse its critique. This, among other things, means that the continental tradition has come to the wholesome and welcome realization that its picture of reality is but an image in a mosaic constituted by the multiverse of our shared human existence. It means that the Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu, African religion, and other heritages or traditions of faith and modes of being are differing manifestations of the mystery of existence in its openness to that which is. It means that human life concretely shows itself in various incommensurable and irreducible expressions whose variegated actuality is our common resource. It also means that Europe's myopic and silencing monologue has finally come to an end. In this regard, Gadamer's critique of the Enlightenment's critique of prejudice and his reclaiming of a positive or an enabling concept of prejudice or prejudgment is a tangible contribution to efforts in African philosophy focused on the critique of Eurocentrism. This is so because for Gadamer we can experience our past or other traditions in an authentic way only if we are willing to tangibly question quote, the four meanings available to us, and to examine explicitly the legitimacy, that is, the origin and validity of the four meanings present within us, end quote. In effect, this means maintaining a vigilant critical stance, grounded in its finite situatedness, out of which it can possibly encounter the past and or other traditions. This is the stance that Gadamer in Truth and Method names the effective historical consciousness, a stance which, quote, always sees its own present in such a way that it sees itself as it sees the historically other, end quote. In other words, in being alert to its situated finitude, in this concrete awareness, it sees itself as historically other vis-à-vis the historically other. In relating to the past and or other traditions, this awareness, the one that Gadamer formulates or names effective historical consciousness, this awareness allows that which it encounters to come forth in what it says, precisely because it starts from its own situated finitude and limited distinctive particularity. This is how Gadamer puts it, for example, in an interview given 1 year before the end of his long and productive life. He states, quote, we still do not really know anything about what our civilization with its skyscrapers and powerful machines means for human beings living in other parts of the world. Who knows, perhaps we'll come to see that the relaxed conversation of a Chinese wise person with his disciples also has something to contribute, something that is quite different from the logic and desire for proof we first learned from the Greeks, and which we have developed into an instrument to dominate the world, and thereby perhaps have also disfigured it, end quote. What is of interest to us in the above is that for Gadamer, the relaxed conversation of a Chinese wise person with his disciples can teach us or contribute something that is quite different than what we, i.e. the West, have appropriated from the Greeks and developed into an instrument to dominate the world, and thereby perhaps have also disfigured it. For Gadamer, then, the specificity of Chinese culture is different, not grotesque or bizarre, as it was for Kant, for example, and it has something to contribute. This recognition of difference and the possible contributions of others presupposes a curbing on Gadamer's part of his own interpretative stance. He does not start, in other words, as Levinas does, with the specification that, quote, humanity consists of the Bible and the Greeks, nor does he insist that everything else in the world must be included in this and that Europe is central. Quite to the contrary, Gadamer is concerned with, quote, remaining open to the meaning of the other person or text, end quote. There is here, it has to be noted, a projective seeking that consciously owns up to its finitude and is fully aware of its specific and distinctive particularity, an awareness that begins by acknowledging, as we noted above, the limitedness and possible flaws of its own historical heritage. And so, read generously, a Chinese wise person can be a placeholder for a sage and or a philosopher from any other culture. Gadamer himself suggests such a generous reading when elsewhere in the same book of interviews, as we saw earlier, he states that we need to accept our worldwide heritage. Gadamer's stance would thus be open to and welcoming of the 17th century Abyssinian philosopher Zara Yaqub, who defines his work as a hatata, a critical examination of sedimented traditions. For just as the Chinese wise person, Zara Yaqub too might well have something to contribute. And this would be a contribution focused on the critical interpretative sifting and sieving of that which, quote, people hastily accept from their fathers, end quote. For as one can show by an explorative exposition of Zara Yaqub's text, for him as for Gadamer, the task of interpretative reflection, i.e. the task of hermeneutics, arises out of the need to make sense of one's own heritage, or as Gadamer puts it in Truth and Method, understanding, quote, understanding becomes a special task only when misunderstandings have arisen. In this effort, quote, openness to the opinions of others or of the text constitutes the hermeneutical task. All of this shows, and very strongly, the receptivity of Gadamer and of philosophical hermeneutics to the heritage of other cultures. It also indicates that the work of those of us who labor at or in the margins of this tradition has had a direct and or indirect effect of deflating or corroding the constricted views of bygone days. This is what I have named elsewhere the critical negative aspect of the contemporary discourse of African philosophy, which is focused on intellectual decolonization. For in spite of the fact that formal colonialism has ended, its residual effects, particularly in the realm of ideas and concepts, are still with us. Intellectual house cleaning is thus a necessary supplement for the consummation of our political self-liberation. Just as the political and armed struggles of the last century ended the de facto actuality of colonialism, the ongoing critical negative project of African philosophy has to engage in undoing the de jure philosophic underpinnings that justified this now defunct actuality. For the ending of formal colonialism by force of arms has to be not merely the termination of the balance of physical force that actualized it, but also, and more importantly, the ending of the era of Western hubris that made it possible. With Rousseau, one has to recognize that force for or against colonialism does not and cannot bestow political and or moral sanction on its effects. Such sanction, as in the past, is the task of philosophic reflection, the kind of reflexive thinking that we just glimpsed in Taylor, Gadamer, and Vattimo, a kind of reflection that is open to the possible. To be sure, beyond the realm of European and or African philosophizing, this promising theoretic situation of the present, avowed by the above noted continental philosophers, and which is the reflective space in which African philosophy situates itself, was created, when all is said and done, by the armed and political struggles of the formerly colonized. The critically self-aware stance of continental philosophers and the destructive reflections of African Africana philosophers are both encouraging theoretic effects brought about by the dure struggle against and the final demise of unmitigated Western dominance. As Vattimo points out, quote, "It is understood that the actual crisis of the unitary conception of history, the consequent crisis of the idea of progress and the end of modernity, are not events solely determined by theoretic transformations. The critiques that 19th century historicism, idealistic, positivistic, Marxist, suffered on the level of ideas. Many more and diverse things have come to pass. The primitive peoples designated as such and colonized by the Europeans in the name of the right of superior and more evolved civilization to colonize have rebelled and made problematic de facto a unitary centralized history." End quote. This is what has made it possible for non-European voices in the realm of philosophy, as in many other fields, to become audible. For the fracturing of a unitary centralized history, the demise of the mighty and inglorious empires of Europe, looked at from the other side, give us a glimpse of the face of the other, a differing humanity, in the act of insurgent transfiguration. This fracturing makes room for the visage of another humanity in the very act of reclaiming itself, a reclaiming of self possible only in and by reinstating the multiverse, the cultural, historical, variegated multiplicity in which the West, along with the rest of us, existed before the age of colonial effacement. And so, within the contemporary discourse of continental philosophy, a new awareness is coming to the fore regarding the historicity of the Occident and its violent, debilitating effects on the rest of the globe. This recognition is not, and it should not be, a trite atonement for past sins. Rather, it should see and constitute itself as the opening of a possibility for the West to seriously engage itself on an equal footing with all the other cultural historical facets that in sum comprise the multiple aspects of our world. In this context, the Occident becomes once more an interlocutor among equal interlocutors in a multivocal dialogical setting. In this, what has to be noted is that what is possibly coming to pass is the dialectical restoration on a more concrete level of the multiple voices that constituted our mutual humanity before the coming of the modern age and colonial effacement. It ought to be remembered in this regard that in the days of Marco Polo and or the Crusades, our globe was constituted by multiple worlds in war and or peace and in a constant process of fruitful cross-fertilization. What is possibly coming to pass is then a return to this multiplicity of existence in full recognition that this is the more suitable condition for our shared and dependent humanity. An interdependent humanity. This is what Césaire means when he states, quote, my conception of the universal is of a universal rich with all that is particular, rich with all the particulars, the deepening and coexistence of all particulars, end quote. 10 years after Césaire, Gadamer echoes or expresses an analogous sentiment when he states that, quote, it is through our finitude, the particularity of our being, which is evident even in the variety of languages, that the infinite dialogue is opened in the direction of the truth that we are, end quote. Césaire and Gadamer echo each other out of culturally, historically differing thematic concerns, precisely because each articulates a perspective in view of the possibilities of the other. For as Gadamer puts it, a truly historical consciousness is open to the historically other in awareness of its finitude. Or, as Vattimo puts it, to really embrace our historicalness is to recognize that, quote, the continuity with human history, which we carry with us in traces, logical structures, forms of experience, in language, is the only possible source of criteria, of rules, of rational, better, reasonable directives, which is given to us to possess, end quote. In this picture of things, the plurality of particulars of Césaire and Gadamer are the differing heritages or languages in and through which we maintain our continuity with the history of humanity. Indeed, these constitute for us of the present a historically variegated multiple common resource, a storehouse of treasures, as Vattimo puts it. African philosophy in this regard is a situated source of dialogue, a component of this multi-vocal dialogical state of affairs, or a universal of particulars, on which Césaire and Gadamer are focused. It is the eager philosophic voice of the formerly enslaved and colonized that seek, past or beyond the demise of colonialism, a dialogical coexistence focused on the explorative sharing of the storehouse of treasures, which is composed of our differences and concurrently grounds the infinite dialogue of the truth that we are in an ongoing manner. Indeed, a dialogical humanity beyond Europe's violently overbearing and silencing monologue, an interplay of particulars focused on an interlinked mutual interdependence. In this regard, and in keeping with the unfulfilled promise of the African liberation struggle, contemporary African philosophy has tried to think beyond the present the possibility of further and tangibly actualizing the independence of Africa. On the one hand, it has engaged in a systemic critique of the Western tradition and of the residual concepts and ideas that have defined and painted Africa into the corner of dependence and subservience. On the other hand, it has been a released engagement with the Western tradition focused on a fusion of horizons in an effort to actuate a return to the source in view of concretely, fusion of horizons, by the way, is a phrase quoted from Gadamer, and return to the source from Cabral. I'm sorry, I skipped that. In an effort to actuate a return to the source in view of concretely reclaiming what Marcien Towa has named our generic human identity. This is the Dasein, or the there being of our human existence, which, quote, as the constitutive activity of all culture and history, is elevated above all particular cultures and histories, because it is that which engenders them all, end quote. And in this, not by renouncing or turning its back on its hybrid heritage, but by affirming it in seeking a shared understanding in a world with others. For as Gadamer has observed, only through others do we gain true knowledge of ourselves, end quote. Others for whom we are other, in a dialogical interplay of our mutually irreducible singularities, make for our responsible and thus responsive cohabitation of our shared globe. As the Igbo proverb has it, another man's corpse seems to us like a log of wood. Chinua Achebe explicates the sense of this proverb by telling us that what the proverb is saying is that, quote, we can learn from the battered corpse by the roadside not simply by observing it, but by creating the chastening fiction that we are it, that the corpse of another man is not a log of wood, but ourselves. In the next sentence, slightly amending himself, he notes that, on further reflection, the proverb is not, in fact, the outrageous thing I have just said. Rather, he points out, what the proverb tells us is that, quote, another man's corpse seems to us like a log of wood, which, as Achebe points out, quote, is a rather different matter and a very sad reflection on our impaired imagination, on our malfunctioning powers of identification with the plight of our fellows or with the plight of others, end quote. Along similar lines, reflecting on the situation of intercultural relations and efforts at understanding differing societies and epochs, Charles Taylor writes, the challenge is to be able to acknowledge the humanity of their way while still being able to live ours, end quote. What I've tried to show, in contradistinction to Levinas and the colonial past, is that the acuity of this other-directed thinking on both sides, it is the acuity of this other-directed thinking on both sides that has made possible the thematic encounter mentioned in the title. This encounter needs to be further elaborated. We need to cultivate the reciprocity, the norms, values, ideas, in short, the enabling prejudices and prejudgments that will open us up towards each other. This is the common ground of the differing concerns of continental and African philosophy. This is the shared terrain, as Gadamer puts it, of the infinite dialogue in the direction of the truth that we are. Thank you.